Welcome to another edition of the Basketball Teacher Podcast. Our mission is to bring you discussions on a wide array of topics in the coaching world to grow players on and off the court. You can connect with us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and also reach us directly through email at basketballteacherpodcast@gmail.com. Now, here's your host, Coach Mike Hernandez.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us here for another episode. Wherever in the world you're listening to us from, whatever platform y'all are listening to us on, as always, thank you guys so much for the support, the kind messages, the emails, the tweets, the questions, all the stuff that you've sent the show's way. Keep that coming. It is really appreciated, and I do read all of them. So thank you in advance for that. And let's kind of jump into our episode here. We're going into defense, and specifically, we are going to be diving into the Packline defense. We're going to talk a little bit about the implementation of the Packline and running the Packline, but also we'll talk about, with my guest, some adaptations that he's made to the Packline defense, adapting it, tweaking it, making some changes to it to fit the personnel, to fit the goals of this coach's system, and make the Packline work for them, because ultimately that's what we got to do on offense or defense, right? Is make our system work for us. We might have a structure in place, but all those structures may need some adaptation or some tweaking in order to make it perfect for our guys or for our girls. So that's what we're going to get into today, some Packline defense. Love talking defense, so really excited to get into this. And of course, I do not do this alone. I'm very happy to be joined by the head girls coach, taking over at Elkhorn South High School. Coach Jake Nannen is joining us today. Coach, pleasure having you on here. How are things?
Thanks, Coach. Things are going well. Settling into the new position, getting to work with some of the new players on our team, and hitting the summer full throttle here. I appreciate having me on, and I'm looking forward to getting started to talk some Packline D.
Love it. As we both kind of alluded to, I know that this is a new stop for you as you're taking over at Elkhorn South. So, Coach, let's start with your basketball journey and your coaching journey. Where's the game of basketball taking you, and where did it go that ultimately led you to where it is you're at now at Elkhorn South?
Absolutely. So, growing up, my family was always majorly into the game of basketball. My grandpa was a longtime high school coach here in Nebraska, and I think his love for the game kind of trickled down to me, something that I considered my main sport throughout my youth and through high school. And I was lucky to have some great coaches and mentors along the way. I attended Morningside College, which is now Morningside University, up in Sioux City, Iowa, and had the opportunity to play college basketball up there under head coach Jim Sykes. And they compete in the NAIA. And that's when I really started to open up my eyes to the coaching world. And Coach Sykes was very offensive based. The GPAC is a very fast-paced conference. And he did a very nice job with not only teaching us things how to be successful on the court, but also how to be successful off the court and manage your time, be a great individual. And some of those skills that Coach Sykes taught us at Morningside are still with me today. Once I graduated from Morningside, I moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, and started my coaching journey. I hopped on staff at Lincoln Southwest High School on the boys' side and served as the assistant varsity coach under Coach Alex Baugh. And then I moved across town the next year on the boys' side to coach the JV boys at Lincoln Southeast High School. And as I continued to, develop my own philosophy, things I liked from those other coaches, things I didn't like, I had the opportunity to move down south to the Kansas-Nebraska border to a town of about 2,000 people called Superior down in Nebraska. And I was given the opportunity to be the head girls basketball coach down in Superior, and was lucky enough to have some great individual talent down there that led to some great team success for us. And those 3 years have given me the opportunity to continue to refine my philosophy. And after 3 great years, I have moved up to the Omaha metro area and am now the head girls coach at Elkhorn South High School. So all of those stops along the way have kind of gotten me to where we are here, and just continuing to learn and grow and develop as a leader as I take over here at Elkhorn South.
Awesome. And it sounds like, and from what we kind of talked about before we started recording, that where it is that you're at now, or the region you're at, is that the most like populous? Is that kind of one of the bigger areas for basketball in the state?
It is. So Elkhorn South and most of the surrounding Omaha area compete in the Class A or Class B level, which is the top two classifications of biggest enrollment in the state. So it's been a bit of a change coming from Superior, Nebraska, which competes in the C2 level, which is just on the lower side of our classification system here in Nebraska.
Awesome. Before we dive into Packline, I wanted to touch a little bit on some practice and a little bit on your interest and your passion. I know that you said that you've become really passionate about, which was small-sided games. And so I wanted to ask you about if there was a particular event or anything that got you really interested on the concept of small-sided games, and also were there any like particular types of small-sided games or particular things you like to do within those small-sided games when you run them in your practices?
Sure. So small-sided games for us are our preferred method of teaching offensive and defensive decision making. We very much believe that reps against live competition give us much increased development of skill as opposed to one-on-0 skill work. We like to try to balance that out with about 80-20. So about 20% of the time we want to refine our individual skills one-on-0, and about 80% of the time we want to put that to the test in a live competitive setting. And one major influence for small-sided games in my career has been John Leonzo, who is now, I believe, the assistant women's coach at Wright State. And he has a lot of great content out on YouTube, on Twitter, and he really sparked that initial interest for me in learning more about these small-sided games and teaching players how to make proper decisions. You know, with the pace of the game nowadays, players are always making these decisions on the fly offensively. You know, do I need to catch to shoot, or do I need to react to attack? Do I need to finish at the rim, or do I need to pass where the help came from? So we believe that those small-sided games are some of the best and quickest ways to improve their decision making while all of these players are getting these individual reps. And you mentioned what type of small-sided games we enjoy doing. And, you know, our one-on-one small-sided games where we focus on giving the offensive player an advantage with maybe the defender facing the rim or the defender on our hip, we feel has really helped us with our finishing ability at the rim, as opposed to going through your daily dozen layup lines, going through your jab step, L-cut rips, one-on-0. And then we just kind of progress up from there. We build up to our 2-on-2, where we're focused more on reading the help defender's chest. And then we continue building up to 3-on-3 and a 5-on-5 setting. So we think all around, this is just the fastest way for players to improve, get individual touches. And we don't disregard that one-on-0 skill work, but we'd like to find ways for kids to be playing in live competitive situations as best as we can.
And it seems like what is a really big emphasis on these small-sided games that you do is players' decision making. And I feel like that is one of the greatest benefits that you get out of doing small-sided games, is you really get to see what your players are thinking. And I know for me as a coach, that's invaluable to actually in real time see my players' thought process and decision making, and in a sense reading and reacting to what is happening either defensively or offensively.
Exactly. And a lot of people think, you know, when programs are doing small-sided games and they're kind of just throwing them out there, the players, I think the misconception is that coaches aren't teaching when they do these small-sided games. And in our opinion, that couldn't be further from the truth. We want to be very detailed with the reads players are making. We want to be very detailed and aware of the type of constraints we're giving players. And maybe most importantly, we want to connect those small-sided games to what we want to try to do offensively. So we're very picky with the small-sided games we select, and we make sure everything connects so it can be that teaching opportunity as opposed to the quote unquote, here's a game, try it out, and then we'll move on.
Sure. And I've even been in that situation too, and I'm sure you have too, where you see players maybe making inaccurate reads or inaccurate decisions when faced in certain situations. And I think you mentioned, right, you'll put defenders in certain spots or in certain positions, maybe to specifically work on a player's ability to read what they're supposed to do when, as you said, defenders at their hip, or if maybe the help doesn't come, or there's a certain advantage or disadvantage in one way. And you can really kind of put players exactly where you want to and kind of see where they react in a situation like that, and get them the reps that they need to hopefully improve it in a game situation.
Right. And along with that, small-sided games can also be beneficial for numerical advantages.
Sure.
We do a lot of transition small-sided games where we're attacking in our primary break 5-on-3. We're pushing that 4-on-2. So I think there's a lot of great ways to teach the game, and by no means is small-sided games the end-all be-all, but it has definitely sparked my interest, and I think we've seen some success with it at my last stop, and hopefully continue that here as well.
And just to put a cap around it, I don't know if you'd agree with me too, but I know one of the things I really enjoy about them too is players can't hide in them. They can't like disappear that they would in maybe a bigger 5-on-5 setting. Of course, there's value to that as well, but I like in those like 2-on-2, 3-on-3, even those 2-on-1, 3-on-2 situations, like you can't disappear offensively or defensively. There's too few players that like everybody needs to be involved and everyone needs to be active in what's going on.
Exactly. And, I think it's fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's engaging for the players. I'm sorry, but personally, I don't want to do 15 minutes of stationary ball handling every practice. I don't want to spend 15 minutes doing daily dozen layup lines and footwork. So I think nowadays it's a player's game, and we have to make sure we're adapting to their interests and keeping them engaged as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Coach, shifting over to Packline, let's start with the desire that you had to use Packline. What made you want to install Packline in the first place? And if you could kind of talk about the process of installing the Packline and why that was, in your opinion, the best choice for your program to use.
So the main thing that really got us sparked into the Packline was a defense that could fit our mission statement as a program. And our mission statement on the defensive side of the ball is we are committed to giving up one contested jump shot on every possession outside of the paint. And we firmly believe that Packline being predicated on keeping teams out of the paint, being big in the gaps, and really predicating everything on your closeout and scaffolding that from behind fit that mission statement perfectly. And another thing we really enjoyed about finding the Packline and putting that into place is we think it has a lot to do with putting the trust behind the on-ball defender as a team defense. You know that if you do get beat, you have a teammate to your left in the gap. You have a teammate to your right in the gap. And you have to move on a string together in order for that Packline to be successful. And one thing we found is it really helped us keep those very athletic and quick teams out of the paint and helped us kind of even the playing field with our athletic ability. We firmly believe that wherever we went with that mentality of being in the gap and forcing those contested jump shots out of the paint, really kind of flipped that switch as a part of our DNA as a program. So, just all in all, the general idea of trusting each other and contesting all jump shots while basically being full-time help off the ball really just had us fall in love with it. So you mentioned installing the Packline. We're firm believers in the whole part whole teaching method. We kind of break down the installation into a couple of different parts. And once we've shown the whole puzzle, we start breaking it down piece by piece. And our preferred method of installation is we start with our closeouts. We talk about how our positioning should be on the ball. And then we slowly progress into our 1 pass away gap, our 2+ passes away help side eye, baseline drive rotations. And then we start thinking about guarding common actions, such as ball screens, down screens, flare screens, etc. So just wanted to mention that this is not a defense that you can install quickly.
No, there's a lot. It's a team defense, yeah, and there's a lot going on.
It is, and I do think you can show the whole picture fairly easily, but we're very detailed with our approach, and there's a lot of specifics that we have from closeouts to getting to our help side eye that really takes a lot of time to get down and hopefully perfect.
I was gonna say, even and you mentioned about closeouts, even something like that is not necessarily something that's easy to do. And I was curious, just thinking about some of the pieces involved in it, just something like a closeout. Do you have specific principles or specific rules that you and your players always adhere to when it comes to a closeout, or are there certain things that you absolutely expect to happen for a closeout to be considered a good one?
We do. And our first closeout key is we're still firm believers in sprinting to the closeout until you're about 3/4 of the way there. And then we prefer to break down and chop our feet to stay on balance.
Okay, great. Yeah.
We say sprint. We say blind the shooter with a high hand to contest the shot as you go out. And we always prefer that we close out as we're sprinting and chopping with our outside hand. And we would define our outside hand as the hand closest to the sideline or baseline. And the reason we prefer the outside hand being high, regardless of where the offensive player's shooting pocket is we believe it's just a couple more bits of leverage to force teams middle as opposed to baseline. And as we're closing out, we very much prefer that we are straddling the offensive player's lower leg, which is, again, considered closest to the baseline. And we always have to keep our tail to the basket. As you know, the last thing we want is to open up the gates and give teams the middle.
There's a good term there that you'll hear a lot, the opening of the gate. That's yeah.
Yeah, so we really, really prefer that we keep our tail pointed to the basket. And we think with closing out with our outside hand and straddling that low offensive player's leg, that we kind of give ourselves extra leverage to take away that baseline drive without giving them the middle. So we try our best to be very specific with our closeouts, and those are just a couple of things that we look for and hopefully try to simplify for our players as time goes on.
And one of the reasons I asked about that question specifically is I think that it kind of lends to the point that you said about how long it takes to kind of do this piece by piece. Even something like a closeout, there is a lot that goes into it in terms of the positioning and the way that you're aligning yourself, and depending on where the other players are on the floor, where the offense and where the ball is moving. I think that speaks to the amount of precision that is involved in really getting, a team defense like the Packline where you want it to be. And I was curious about, in your experience, how long was the implementation process where before it got to the point where you felt like it was getting to where you wanted it to be?
Yeah, I would say when I was down in Superior with my first head coaching job, we were not where we wanted to be for probably the entire first full season.
Mm,
And I don't think we really hit our stride with our pack line defense until about halfway through my second season as I was installing. That was about the time where I felt really comfortable with what we were doing and we had all of our habits down.
yeah, I mean that's a journey to be sure, and with that, there is going to be mistakes along the way. There's going to be some trial and error. There's going to be some refinement and things that need to be, adjusted as you go through it. And as you're going through that process, you said, I think about a year and a half or so before it kind of was getting to where you wanted to. What were some of the trial and errors? What were some of the mistakes that either you or your players were making that had to be corrected and fixed? To kind of walk us through some of the ups and downs and a little bit of the journey that you went through implementing the pack line.
Sure. So I think the first thing that really struck us as a coaching staff was against the more athletic and skilled teams we were playing, the pack line was doing its job. We were staying consistent and we were leveling that playing field, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But when we began to play some of those teams that we were more athletic and quicker than, teams were able to chew more of the clock and really move the ball at their own free will because we didn't have anybody in the passing lanes. So right away, we noticed that the better teams on our schedule we could compete with, and we were fine with our pack line.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the quote unquote weaker teams we played were able to hang around with us a little longer due to the safety of the pack line defense. So that was one thing we noticed right away as kind of something we needed to figure out moving forward. And another problem that we encountered is being in that gap. And as teams begin to attack that player in the gap, it took a long time for our players to keep that open stance in the gap and not turn their backs to their man as they helped on the drive. We found that when that would happen, teams could back cut on us very easily, and all of a sudden we were in a scramble situation. And then I'd say kind of a final thing we noticed as we were pretty much true pack line those first couple of years is a lot of those pack line teams prefer that their defender in the gap is closer to the ball one pass away than their man. And we found that that was just too big of a gap to cover. It was really tricky for our kids to get back to the ball and close out successfully without having a blow by or an open three. So we kind of found the sweet spot of being in the gap halfway between man and ball. That was a good point for us to be at where we felt like we could help in the gap on drives and still close out and contest once the ball got kicked out back to our man. So those were just some of the things that popped up through that year and a half for us to try to figure out to make our pack line more effective.
And I'm curious about your thoughts, your assessment about, you mentioned how your players were kind of struggling with turning their backs. And do you attribute that to any particular reason? Was it just something that they intuitively just were doing without even realizing it? Was there a reason why they were, completely turning their backs the way they were on defense? Or what do you kind of attribute that to? Because I think that's kind of fascinating that you noticed that as kind of a general trend that your players were doing on the defensive side.
Yeah, I think it was the mentality of making sure they were fully helping and committing to stop the drive.
Like all in on it. Yeah.
Right. And sometimes I think, we were probably getting a little greedy with trying to get steals in the gap, trying to get deflections as they were driving into that gap. And, it probably had a little bit to do with my teaching of it as well. As I was exploring this defense and installing it, I'm sure there were some things along the way where I wasn't making perfect sense for the players either. But over time, you learn, you adjust. And as you continue to emphasize that open stance in the gap, just like anything, kids begin to pick it up. It becomes habitual, and you just got to stick with it. So I will definitely take some blame with that as well. There's probably some things I didn't teach as well as I should have.
And that's fine. I think when that happens, because we're all in that way, and I think that for us as coaches to just understand that, hey, maybe the way I'm communicating something or the way I'm trying to show something isn't working. I don't want to just trying to keep ramming my head through the wall. Let's just try and communicate it or approach it in a different way. And if that's the way that my players are going to make sense of it, then I should probably communicate it to them that way.
Right. So I think just really hammering home keep that open stance as the ball's coming at us, just over time begin to, like I said, become habitual. So
yeah, absolutely. I did want to mention, or did want to ask you before we kind of talk about some of the adaptations and tweaking. I know that Packline is so dependent as a team defense, and there has to be, kind of five acting as one, and there's got to be, everyone's got to kind of know their positions, be in the gaps. Communication is key. How was that process of getting five to act as one and everybody to be where they needed to be, where that they were all in the right spot at the same time? What went into getting five to act as one and be a true team defense doing the pack line?
Yeah, first and foremost, I think a large piece of that was our players bought in. They understood what we were trying to do. They understood how it fit with our system. And player buy-in was a big piece to that. Another big piece to kind of getting all five of those players on a string, so to speak, was our terminology. Typically within our defense, you're in one of three spots. You're on the ball, you're in the gap, or you're in help side eye. So having consistent terminology with all players as well and holding them accountable to that, I think really helped keep those five players on a string. And if there was one phrase that I'm sure you've heard, and I would recommend to anyone being interested in the pack line, it's just moving on the flight of the ball and jumping to the ball defensively in the pack line is a critical term to keeping those five players on a string. If all players aren't moving with a purpose as the ball is in the air, you're going to be late to your rotations and you're going to be late to your positions. So that was one phrase that I think really helped, along with some of those other things, is, jumping to the ball and moving on the flight of it, I think really helped everyone kind of stay on a string.
And what went into that? Are we talking about you doing a lot of shell drill, or what sort of drills you think really got everybody moving to the flight of the ball and not being slow or late on the ball movement?
Yeah. So we're still, I guess you could call it, quote unquote, old school.
All right.
I see on Twitter every now and then, of people trying to get rid of shell drill and why shell drill is bad. But I think as a teaching drill, shell drill is as good as it gets. And we do have some progressions, whether it's a 4-on-4 or 5-on-5 setting. We'll typically go through our basic positioning, our ball side cuts, away screens, middle drives, you name it. And that was probably the best, and is probably the best way to teach those basic fundamentals of the pack line. So we do that drill very consistently as a teaching portion of our practice.
I think shell drill, just to me personally, I think just has value in that it's very visually, I think it just does a great job just making sure that everybody's in the right spot. And I think it's just such a good teaching tool to make sure that those foundational skills, and especially those base skills are where you need them to be, that I feel as if your team kind of needs to be able to effectively go through, shell drill and be able to know their assignments on a shell drill before you can really comfortably move to want to do anything else.
Absolutely. And that's also the best time to emphasize your terminology.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm glad we're on the same page about shell drill.
Well, the terms too, if you want to make sure that the terms are being spoken and everybody knows what the terms are, I mean, you can, and almost like we talked about small-sided games, it's shell drill, some one of those things you can make very, particular on certain things. If there's a certain thing you're looking at, you can run that in through your shell drill, and you can, emphasize and hammer that point home. Like I think it has a lot of uses, and I think that sometimes, and I've been there too as a coach, sometimes I want to kind of move on to maybe more intricate or more complex things, but making sure that we have something as foundationally important as a shell drill down. I mean, I think it can't be overstated, or it really is that important. At least it is, I know, to my program.
Right. You've got to get that foundational piece down first.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they're doing that consistently, we always think about 90% of the time. If we're doing something 90% of the time correctly, we can probably add our next layer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I like that. I like that a lot. Okay, so I know you mentioned this a little bit earlier in one of your earlier answers, but let's talk about some of the adaptations and some of the tweaks you've made with the pack line along the way. So, what would you say would be maybe kind of more of the traditional things that you would see out of a pack line, and what adaptations or tweaks have you made out of that, quote unquote traditional pack line alignment or philosophy?
Yeah. So for the most part, that first piece that was really big for us was, at least from most perspectives of a traditional pack line, the gap is closer to the ball than your man. And we had already talked about, for us at least, that was just not doable.
Mm-hmm.
It was really tricky for us to close out back to our man, and we would give up straight line drives and open threes. So we did, like I mentioned before, switch that to simply being halfway between man and ball and forming that shallow triangle. Another thing I think is important for coaches to think about if they're interested in the pack line is, how can we pressure teams besides being on the ball? And last year, we had a pretty athletic team that we really felt like it would have been a disservice for us to not allow more, quote unquote, freedom in the gap.
Okay.
So my first 2 years down in my other job, we were gap defense to the core. The golden rule of the only player outside of the pack line is the player guarding the ball.
Sure.
And we were true to that. I mean, we were pack line to the core. But with having a bit of more athleticism and speed, we slowly but surely started to give our players more freedom in the gap to, if they make a read from the offensive player's shoulders and eyes, and they're certain they might be able to get a deflection one pass away, we would give certain players the freedom to get out of the pack line and go get it. And that was something that was tricky for me to let go of.
Yeah,
because we had some success with that, where we're plugging that gap. This is what we do. But like I mentioned, it was really giving our roster a disservice last year. So that was one tweak that we provided for our players to put a little more pressure on some of those teams that weren't as athletic as us. And of course, we would pull back the reins. Maybe player A was getting a little too aggressive one pass away. Maybe player C was sitting in the gap too much and not using their athletic ability. So this year, in a way, we kind of turned into about a 75-25, where 75% of the time we're plugging that gap. And just to mix it up a little bit, we'd tell a player to go shoot that gap and see if you can get your hand on a ball so we can get some quick transition points the other way.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one thing that's always been tricky for me, as opposed to a traditional pack line, is figuring out how we can pressure the other team in different ways that, a half court pack line wouldn't give you otherwise.
And what kind of went into the process of kind of giving those players that freedom? Was it just kind of a message that you gave to certain players that if they see something they can go for it? Was it kind of a general message? Like what kind of goes into maybe loosening it a little bit and kind of giving players a little bit more freedom? How is that kind of like earned in that sort of situation for you?
Sure. So there were definitely certain players that we would tell to be more aggressive in that gap to see if they could get their hand in the ball or in the passing lane. But for the most part, we really handed it over to the players, and we let them use their IQ defensively more than we have in the past to read the offensive player and see if they could get out and get that. And the funny thing is, over time, those players start to realize, I guess you can say, if they're good enough to do that or not. Because over time, if you continue to jump that gap and try to get your hand on the ball and you're not getting it, the more you'll see we're starting to break down defensively and getting put in scramble situations. So really just allowing the players to play, use their natural ability defensively, and of course, keeping our paws on them, so to speak, as the season goes on, I think really helped them play a little bit more freely.
And do you where does the press, or where does full court pressure work its way into your pack line? Are you a press heavy team and then fall into the pack line? Do you play mostly half court? What's your philosophy been on pressure and full court defense?
Yeah, it really depends on our makeup. My first 2 years down in Superior, we were very half court based. And one thing we did those first 2 years was we every now and then would throw in a trap the first pass on the wing within the half court to try to mix it up a bit. And this last year, with the roster that we have, we did throw some full court pressure in the repertoire. And we were a big 3/4 court 1-2-2 full court pressure team. And we would do some trapping out of that. And yes, we would fall back into our half court pack line. And that was another great way to kind of mix up our protective defense with more of times to be aggressive and look to turn opponents over.
Was it easy to get back into the pack line with when you had some pressure going? I know some teams struggle a little bit with going into, a full court pressure or some sort of a press, or especially if it's going to be like a zone press type situation, and then falling into a half court defense. Was that something that your program was kind of able to kind of seamlessly fall into if that press or that trap got broken, or was there an adjustment period to that? What was that like getting into your pack line when you did put some pressure on the ball?
That was definitely the trickiest part of getting from our 1-2-2 press back to our pack line man. And there were times where we would give up easy buckets, but we always felt like as long as we were staying positive to negative with our press and forcing turnovers and getting quick transition points ourselves, that it was worth the risk. So to answer your question, that is very difficult. It takes a lot of communication. It takes a lot of extra effort. And that was definitely a weakness of ours, was going from our full court press, getting back to our pack line positioning.
And I think that kind of goes into the point we talked about the importance of communication. I think to be able to communicate and to get everybody back into their position, I think, and I'm going back to what we talked about earlier, I think that's why something like shell and getting your terminology and everything down right in a shell drill type situation is so important, because when you're in scramble mode, if the press gets broken and everyone's got to get into their spot in the pack line, you have to make sure that your players know how to communicate and be in the right spot and everybody knows where everybody is.
And that definitely fits in with some of those transitional small-sided games we talked about earlier too.
Yeah.
Is making sure that you're not only giving the offense numerical advantages, but giving those defenders numerical disadvantages and really forcing them to scramble out and communicate well, I think all connects back to that question of transitioning from your full court press back to really any defense. I think man-to-man is a little trickier than falling back to a zone, but all of it remains difficult in my opinion.
Is there a shot clock in Nebraska? Do you have one?
Class A, the highest classification, does have one, and they just finished up year one with a shot clock. So next season, or this upcoming season, Class A and Class B will have a 35-second shot clock. So slowly but surely it's trickling its way down.
So you have not had one. Am I correct? When you've been running this, you have not been in a shot clock situation?
Correct. This will be my first year with a shot clock
Okay,
upcoming.
so my question then with that is, I have seen in some of the Packline that I have seen teams on the offensive end when there is no shot clock, they will just work that ball around, work the ball around, and eventually try and find some sort of hole or something that they can do by just outlasting the defense. And so I'm curious about how that's kind of worked in your experience about not having a shot clock, is if you found that teams have just I'm not going to necessarily say impatient, but maybe, just took opportunities like the ones that they thought were open, or some of the earlier opportunities. Did teams try and work you around and work the game clock a lot? What is that like, having a pack line without a shot clock at all?
Yeah. So like we said, one of the main reasons why we selected the pack line is because we believed it really allowed us to compete with some of the top teams on our schedule athletically. And although that helped us a ton with some of the stronger teams on our schedule, like you just mentioned there, it really did become a struggle sometimes against those teams that we would consider less athletic or less skilled. Because you're right, they can be more patient. They can get some extra ball reversals. And that's probably a negative of the pack line without a shot clock, is you can have all the great ball pressure in the world, but if there's no one in the passing lane denying one pass away from you, is that ball pressure really worth it? Because they can make an easy pass. So there were definitely some struggles with that, and trying to find ways to include some pressure in the half court, because it did sometimes allow those less talented teams to hang around and really look for those great shots. And I think that'll change with a shot clock.
Yeah, and that, as we're on the subject of adaptation and changes, I was curious if there's going to be really any changes you may want to do in terms of the way you teach or practice your pack line. But I almost feel, if anything, it's gonna just be a huge advantage for you to now have a shot clock that you have is also to your advantage.
I think so too. And we'll probably try to combine that half court pack line with, again, some type of soft zone pressure in the full court to hopefully allow the opponent, if we don't get a steal, to, get organized with about 25 seconds or so. And then we can really dig deep and get back to our pack line principles to force a contested jump shots outside the paint.
Yeah, I mean that sounds great. I'm just thinking like how great of an advantage that's going to be for teams to have to make a decision, within a certain shot clock parameters, and being forced to try and attack, or maybe forced to make a pass that may or may not be there, but the shot clock's down. And I'm thinking about your players now being able to, be that much more aggressive, or be able to jump those gaps and be able to get those steals. I just imagine you're going to have, you might see some things out of your pack line, or some results out of it that maybe you didn't get the chance to see as much before, and that sounds pretty cool.
Absolutely. And as the levels get higher, obviously the talent becomes much better as well. And nowadays, I mean, I think basketball is as skilled as it ever has been. With the way that kids can shoot it nowadays, with the way that kids can get into the paint and finish. I mean, it's really a pick your poison game nowadays, especially on the defensive end.
And now that is something I was going to follow up with, because it was making me wonder about if you imagine maybe now that you're at Elkhorn South, about whether or not, with the level of competition you're up against, maybe you're going to see teams, who feel confident that they can, shoot their way out of the pack line and get you out of it, and whether or not maybe that's going to be maybe something you're going to have to tweak in terms of the way that you defend, or the way that you close out. I don't know if it will or not, but I am curious at that level, if you're going to see teams who feel empowered or feel confident enough that they can just, shoot from the outside and just shoot you out of it or not. That'll be something really fascinating to kind of follow and monitor.
Definitely. And, everything will be scouting report based. There'll be
Sure.
some kids that we'll be able to have a little bit of a deeper gap against. There'll be some players that will compete against that, might not get any gap help at all. So it'll definitely be personnel based as well, as we work on some tweaks. But with that pick your poison method, all day, every day, I would give up a contested 3-point shot
Yep.
compared to a straight line drive to the rim.
That goes back to what it is you said earlier, right? A contested jump shot outside of the paint. That's the goal. Yeah.
Keyword contested. And we
Yes.
make sure to
Yes.
define that as well.
Yes, got to make sure the closeout principles are there. You don't want to give up wide open jumpers. Yeah, that's why you said, right, working on the closeouts and everything that goes into that, making sure the hands are up high and all that sort of thing. Um, yeah, I've seen some.
Exactly. It
I've
all
seen.
pieces together.
Yeah, no, I've seen some. I've coached some teams who've given up some outside jump shots, and I was like, well, that was a good idea, but we didn't close out at all, and I don't want to give up wide open looks here. But
Right. And if there's a program that is really into their denial, extreme ball pressure, one pass away, I mean, the poison they're picking is the potential for those straight line drive finishes.
yep,
So
yeah.
it's always interesting to see what programs believe in and what type of quote unquote poison they pick with their system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you mentioned, that's where scouting is going to become so valuable, because you'll still, I think, as you mentioned, right, you'll be in the pack line, but just the way that it may look, or the way it may be defended on certain players based on personnel, it like no two pack line defenses you're going to have are going to be the exact same in terms of positioning, because that's where scouting comes. And I think that being versatile and making sure that you have those little tweaks in place is super important, because you got to be ready for that, that knockdown shooter, or whatever the case may be.
No doubt. And once you get that foundation set, you're able to expand into those different tweaks.
Let me ask you about how practice has changed or evolved for you throughout your time doing the pack line. When you're in a position where the pack line's been drilled in, and they're comfortable with it, maybe it's mid-season and they've been doing it for a while and they know what's expected of them, what do you do, and what have you done to still keep working on refining it, improving it, getting it to where it's that much better each day?
Yeah. So once we kind of have laid the foundation with our shell drill, we're feeling pretty comfortable that we're able to move on. We play a lot of gap one-on-one.
Mm-hmm.
And what gap one-on-one is exactly as it sounds. You've got a coach or player, for instance, at the top of the key, and an offensive player on the wing. There's one defensive player guarding the wing player, and the coach at the top of the key and the wing offensive player are playing catch as the defensive player is jumping from the gap and closing out on the ball on the wing. And then usually on the fourth catch, we will play live. And they're working on containing off of a closeout, not allowing baseline drives, and working on those principles that we have. Because quote unquote guarding your yard is a very important piece that can never be neglected within the pack line. And for more team-oriented defensive drills, once shell drill does get a little bit stale that time of the year, we did a lot of our 4-on-4 or 5-on-5 change drill last year, which I stole from Jim Boone, who's
Okay.
been a big big, I guess you can say, role model for me with this Packline defense. And all 4-on-4 change drill is you're doing a half court possession of whatever shell drill progression you want. And then as the coach blows the whistle or yells switch, the offensive player with the ball will put the ball on the ground. Offense will sprint back on defense as the original defensive team executing the shell drill will pick up the ball and attack on offense. And that's a great way to work on transition defense, get some live play in with your offensive philosophy while also mixing in shell and making it a little more competitive.
I like and what results have you seen out of that? Because I know you said you stole it from somewhere. What did you notice right away after doing that? I like that a lot. I'm actually writing that down as you're talking. What did you notice out of your team once you started putting that in?
I think with that change drill, it became more enjoyable for the players to go through their shell progressions, especially at that point of the season. Most of the players are pretty comfortable with their positioning and they just want to play. So mixing in kind of a point of emphasis in that shell drill and then getting up and down the floor, down and back, I think just made it more enjoyable for the players to work on those defensive principles and kind of combine that foundational learning with that competition piece.
I'm a big proponent, and those who've been listening to me for any length of time will know that I'm a big component of anything in practice that can make things competitive. I just find that my players just grow so much when there's competition involved, and I'm just happy to hear you say that because I just think it just matters so much to have that competitive element to even on anything defensively, anything with enough creativity can become competitive. And just on a personal note, I'm very happy that you mentioned the competition aspect there.
Yeah, man, I think that's a big piece of it. And of course, I'm going to reference John Leonzo again because he's been a big piece of my coaching, and he always has believed in the TLC method of learning.
Okay.
And that simply stands for teaching, learning, and competing. And he kind of scaffolds all of these different drills and ideas that he has into that method, and he kind of builds up to helps his players be successful. So I cannot recommend John Leonzo enough. I cannot recommend Jim Boone enough. Those two people have been great people for me to learn from.
Nice. A lot of dropping a lot of recommendations here, which is great. That's awesome. I wanted to ask as we start to wind down a little bit before we hit our concluding segment, in general, in terms of general advice that you would give to, let's say there's a coach listening who they're going to maybe be implementing and putting in Packline for the first time. If you had to give some general advice to a coach who might be in that situation, what advice would you give to a coach who might be looking to, install that Packline and get that going for the first time?
My advice would be Rome is not built in a day. If you want to make your Packline effective, and if you want to be a truly great defensive team, it is going to take time. I would recommend not skipping the details and holding your players accountable to your expectations in order for it to become habitual. I've always gone by the saying that somebody in your program on the coaching staff has to be a little bit crazy about defense, whether it's in game, whether it's in practices. There has to be someone on your staff that is just going wild with energy as you're doing these defensive things, because I think it trickles down to the players. So I would recommend not rushing through anything. Assume that your players don't know anything, even though they probably do, and be confident in it. You chose it for a reason. You go out there and do it the best that you can, and your players will believe in it as well. So those are some things I'd recommend for anyone interested in installing the Packline and really making sure that you're doing your research and know it like the back of your hand.
I think it's so important to your point about having, I think as you mentioned, somebody who's, really excited about it and really amped up about defense, because it's a big task, I think, to be asking our players to, play something as in some ways very intricate, very detailed as a pack line defense, and defense can be very mentally and physically taxing, that it's hard sometimes, especially for teenagers, to get up for it and really get enthused and excited about it. And I think you really do need a coach who's all about defense and really brings the energy on from the sidelines or in practice about defense, because it is a tall task, I think, we ask our players. And I think anything we can do to keep their energy up, I think we owe it to them to keep them amped and keep them excited about playing defense.
Absolutely. And we're firm believers that eventually, maybe it's a year, maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 3 months, the team will take on the personality of the coach.
Yes. Yeah.
So choose your energy wisely, emphasize what's important to you, and slowly but surely it will become important to your players.
Love it. No, that's 100% agreed. Awesome. To wrap up, Coach, there's a couple questions that I ask every guest. So I'll go ahead and start here with this first one, which is thinking back on your coaching career, what is a moment from your coaching career? It doesn't have to be Packline related or anything, just a moment from your coaching career that you think others listening would be able to learn from.
Sure. So I do consider myself still a young coach. The gray hairs and high blood pressure would probably tell you otherwise.
Uh-oh. Okay.
But looking back at my younger years, I think one thing I'd recommend to any young coach looking to get into the quote unquote business is keep it simple. I made the mistake of coming into my first head coaching job with 1,000 different ideas of the type of sets we were going to run, the 2 or 3 different zones we were going to give teams different looks to, all of these different great out of bounds plays. And when it comes down to it, you realize that you can't do any of those things without great skilled players. So I would recommend going into any new job with the mindset of developing players first and finding the offensive and defensive schemes that fit your team best. And the more you are overloading these kids with information, the slower their feet are going to get. Because you know how it is for kids nowadays. They got algebra. They've got 2 or 3 clubs they're participating in. It's going to be tricky for kids to execute all of those millions of different things well. A master of all is a master of none. Mm-hmm. So really try your best to simplify. I know it's hard, but I do really think if you focus more on developing those players and creating skilled players, you'll really be able to run anything that you want successfully.
Yeah, it's always what we do as coaches, as new or young coaches, right? We're going to revolutionize the game of basketball. We have all these ideas. We want to make our mark and leave our imprint on our program. And I've been there. I get way too ahead of myself. And I, no matter what the year is or what the situation I find myself in, I always feel like I'm trying to do way more than I necessarily should be doing. And I gotta step back a little bit and assess the situation for what it is. And it always works out well, but I think there's always that great ambition that especially when I was younger, knew that I wanted to revolutionize the game with all my great ideas, and it didn't quite 100% work out that way.
Right. And with that being said, I think defensively it's a little easier to be nitty and gritty with those details. But offensively, I think with whatever you choose, as long as you're doing it with pace and, you're spacing the floor adequately, I think you'll be able to put your players in situations to be successful.
Yeah, I 100% agree. To wrap up, Coach, I give every guest what I kind of call a 60-second soapbox. It's your platform to get out kind of a final message, a closing idea, kind of a final thought that you want to leave the listeners with. You can kind of take it any direction that you want to. So it's up to you, and I'm not going to time you either. So don't worry, you can go over 60 seconds, but I'm just going to kind of give you the floor, Coach. I'm just going to go ahead and let you take it from here.
Yeah. So, I think as coaches, it's important for us to never stop learning. Have that growth mindset. With all the information out there nowadays, I think it's important to try to expand your knowledge and learn as much as you can about the game. And, I think it's important to keep in mind that the true X's and O's of basketball, especially as a head coach, is really about 15% of the job. Everything else is critical to the development of a program. Making sure you're investing in your youth program, making sure that you have great ways to form leaders, whatever it might be. I think it's important to keep that in perspective as well. And lastly, one of my favorite quotes that has really, really helped me is from the legendary Don Meyer, and it's very common. Whatever you're choosing to do offensively and defensively, it is not what you do, it is what you emphasize. Find 3 to 5 things that are really, really important to your program. I'm currently in the process of doing that, and emphasize it day in and day out, because that's what the players are going to remember. So that is my 60-second soapbox. Hopefully I'm right at that threshold, Coach.
Nice. I think you might have got there right there. That's precision right there, Coach. That's right there on the timer. You're ready for the shot clock next year. I think you're trying to get it right under the gun.
Yeah.
That's funny. Awesome, Coach. Thank you so much for coming on. I feel like we've maybe have just sort of scratched the surface on some Packline stuff. So we should do this again soon. But thank you for coming on, talking about the Packline and how it's worked for you and the changes you've made to it. Really looking forward to following your journey and kind of seeing where things go with the shot clock, like I said, and now that you're at your new spot at Elkhorn South. So keep doing what you're doing. Best of luck getting the Packline going there, and best of luck going forward, Coach. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Coach. I really appreciate you having me on, and let's talk hoops anytime, man. I love talking about it. So thanks again.
Yes, will do. Thank you all for listening. This was another edition of the Basketball Teacher Podcast, and we will see you guys.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Basketball Teacher Podcast. Make sure to connect with us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, or reach us directly through email at basketballteacherpodcast@gmail.com. Take care, be safe, and we'll see you next time.